Hi everyone, I'm Lynn from Finds of Yesterday, and I sell on eBay, Poshmark, and Mercari, and I sell mostly jewelry. And I was out at a thrift store the other day, and I was looking in the jewelry case, and there was this beautiful necklace full of triangle and geometric shapes, and it had bright blue colors, and it said vintage Art Deco. And I knew right away it wasn't from the Art Deco period, which would have been the 1920s. It was simply a new necklace that they had priced at $150 to $200. Sure, it was worth maybe $35, $40, but not the $150 to $200 that they were asking for it. So I walked away and I thought, I guess just a lot of people don't know how to determine if a necklace or a piece of jewelry is actually vintage. So I thought I would share with you some easy tips on how to determine if it is. There's one main tip that you can look at a necklace right away or a bracelet and say, that's not vintage. So let's turn the camera around and I'll show you some of them tidbits. All right, I have several pieces laid out here for you, and I'm going to go through it and just show you some little tips on how I determine if a piece is vintage or not. So what is vintage, first of all? It is when a piece is 20 years old or older. And that means I say from the year 2000 backwards. If it's 2000 or newer, I call them new pieces. So that's how I'm going to refer to the pieces in this video. So if you're out and about and you pick up a necklace or a bracelet and it has this type of a clasp on it, that is a lobster claw clasp. This is the number one way to tell if a piece is vintage or not. This piece right here is not vintage because this clasp was not invented until 1996. That's the best way to determine if it's vintage or not. I know it's close to 2000, but it's the easiest way to determine that. So this is a Simply Vera Wang, and Simply Vera Wang is a newer company, so that's another way to determine if you know your logos. And here is another example of a newer piece with these. You can hear the acrylic beads. If these were glass, it would be a lot heavier and it would clank different. But it has the lobster claw clasp on it. That is new. The backs look a lot like these on these big statement necklaces, and these are popular. You'll see these everywhere at every thrift store you go to. They are not worth very much at all. Then we have this piece, which is a bracelet. It's a pretty cool bracelet, but it has this hook on it, and you think, ooh, a hook. That might be vintage, but it's not. This is a newer, heavier style hook, and you'll find lots of variations of different clasps. So just by handling pieces over and over again, you'll get to know the differences. But these are just some fast tidbits on how to determine if they're vintage or not. So this hook is definitely newer because it's bigger, heavier, different than the old clasps that looked more like this. They're smaller, they're more straight. They have this little rib through them usually. There's another piece here. This one has Japan on it, or Hong Kong is popular with these hook type of older vintage necklaces. So it has a chain that it hooks into. That's pretty common. On this one, it just hooks into this little hook or loop. Another type of clasp is a fold-over clasp, which is like this. It opens, they call it fold-over. You can call it snap because it snaps shut. And this is actually more of an older style clasp. And you'll see that on a lot of vintage bracelets, some necklaces, but a lot of bracelets. But they do still make this fold-over clasp, but they just don't use it quite as much as the lobster claw. That's pretty common. Here's another fold over clasp. They're very similar to each other. Some fold over clasps are a little more elaborate. Here is another type of clasp called the barrel clasp, and it unscrews. And you'll see it pulls apart. And this one is pretty worn. You can see how the color has worn off of it, and that's another good sign that it's vintage, because it has had a lot of years to rub up on somebody's neck and wear off the color, where the newer pieces don't tend to look like that. Here's a screwback earring, which was from the 1930s. So this is definitely vintage. They don't use these anymore. They don't make the backs like this anymore. So that is definitely a vintage piece. Here's another type of clasp, a clip that has this rough metal, and today they would never make that as rough. They make everything a little smoother, more comfortable. This is pretty rough, and these glass beads are pretty common for back in the 1950s. So you'll see these a lot on vintage jewelry. They're just gorgeous and everybody loves them. They're like classic. Then we have brooches. Another way to tell if a brooch or necklace is vintage. Which one of these two do you think is vintage? Aren't they gorgeous? This one on the right is new, the one on the left is vintage. And a good way to tell is look at the prongs on this piece. See the prongs that are holding in the rhinestones? That's pretty common back on vintage pieces. And see how it's got a 3D dome shape to it, and the rhinestones are at different angles. It's just a gorgeous piece. This piece is new. It's flat. Somewhat flat. The rhinestones are glued in. They don't prong set them anymore. There might be some little fake prongs just to look like it's older, but it's not. It's not actually holding the rhinestone in. But see how these actually run past the edge of the setting? That's obviously glued. So that's a new piece. Another way to tell is by this pin. This pin has this flat piece on the bottom, and that flat piece is usually glued onto a brooch. That means it's new. This one happens to have two little stands that it's sitting on, which is not normal for a new piece, but it is definitely new. And again, this piece is always glued onto the brooch. And they use this type of a pin from the 2000s on all the time. Let's go back to this piece. You look at this older piece, and the pin is soldered in 2 points on the actual brooch. It does not have that bar across the bottom. That's a good sign of a better quality brooch and a older piece. Also, while we have this up here, let's look at the rhinestone backs. See how these are cut out? That lets the light shine through the rhinestones. That's always a sign of a better quality piece too. This roll clasp, there's different variations of the roll clasp as well, so that's another whole video. And there's a tube hinge that shows that it's older. That's another video. Here's another type of pin. It's got this V shape with a rivet in the middle. See how that moves? That is a sign from the 1950s, sometimes 60s they still used it, but that's how it's held on. It's not glued on, it's held on by the rivet. Construction of the jewelry was done much better back then. Now everything is glued, but a nice piece. Missing a pearl, missing a dangle. It's still a nice piece. Then we have this type of a pin, which is a C clasp. See the little hook that the pin goes under, and that's a sign that it's early 1900s. It's a C clasp. And if the pin extends past the roll clasp or C clasp, that means it's older. And if the pin extends beyond the end of the piece of jewelry, that means it's even older yet, like early 1900s or even earlier. So this piece is probably 1910, I don't know, somewhere in that general area. It's a shame it's missing a bunch of rhinestones. Then we can also look at the stones, but this is so diverse that it could be another whole video. So these are lucite. It's a lot lighter. This one is glass. It's heavier, but look at the quality of them. They're just gorgeous. They did put a lot more work into their stuff way back, I have to say. And the lucite actually was created in the 1940s by DuPont, and they did still make lucite pieces into the 50s throughout the 70s yet. And then they kind of slowed up on it, but they do still make jewelry today with lucite, which I think we all still love, and it's coming back in style. It's just a great product. We'll go into beads on a different video. The construction of this bracelet has these rivets like the brooch, and that shows a sign that it's from the 1950s, using them rivets again. This is a cool piece from about that time frame. So this piece is a fold-over clasp, and this is vintage. There's a lot of different types of fold-over clasps, but this is a piece you'd have to look at the clasp and the type of chain too, which they still make this type of chain, so you just kind of have to use your judgment on some of the pieces. If you don't know and you definitely want vintage, don't buy it unless you're for sure. Here's another exception to the rule before we go to the key points. These are acrylic beads. It's lightweight. If it was glass, it would have a different sound, but they're prong set. It's made to look vintage. It's a vintage style. You could use the words vintage style, but you can't use the word vintage because it has that lobster claw clasp. If you're going to remember anything, remember that. The lobster claw clasp is new. 1996 forward. One other thing is the pearls are always glued in. They're never prong set. This piece is vintage, but the pearls are glued in because the prongs just don't seem to hold a pearl. So that's another exception to the rule. So the more pieces you handle, the more you'll get to know and understand vintage jewelry. So thank you for joining me. I hope you got something out of this video, and I hope I didn't confuse you anymore. And let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Thanks for joining me. See you on the next one.